Hi everyone, and welcome to another one of our podcasts on the Tony Tonkin Show. Glad you could be with me, and of course, as always, I have Dr. Dee Michelle with me. No surprise there.
Hello.
Hello there. So we've got a number of things that we want to talk about today. Do you want to highlight what areas they cover? So they cover child abuse, which is a really important subject. New South Wales government's response to all of that, and Stan Stefanovic. Is that how you say his name?
Peter Stefanovic.
Peter. Stan's his brother.
Stan's is it?
I don't know.
I don't know.
Who knows? We should probably watch more. We probably should watch more free to air.
Or more Sky News.
Yeah, exactly.
Probably not going to.
And
definitely not after their behaviour.
All right, and the bishop from the Wakely.
Yes,
church,
yes.
yeah?
I kind of wanted to finish with that one because I wasn't sure how to react to the story, so I was going to seek your advice.
Oh, well, that's nice.
Actually,
I'm always happy to give my learned experience and knowledge around all subjects political. So, what do you want to start with?
Shall we start with the Peter Stefanovic story? Because there was just one bit. Most people will probably know the story now about a young man in the Northern Territory who won a fishing competition and got $1 million. Who knew? That was the sort of thing you could do. But anyway, he did. And then he did the rounds of various media outlets, and he was interviewed on Sky News by Peter Stefanovic, who challenged him about something that the young man is now 19, Keegan I think his name is, and he was challenged about something he had done when he was 16.
Yes, it was some 5 years before, wasn't it? 4 or 5 years before.
Yeah, and it seemed to, from the video that I saw, seemed to catch Keegan by surprise, as if he wasn't expecting, in the glory of the moment of winning $1 million, effectively kind of being told off, I suppose, for his earlier behaviour. And since then, Sky News have made an apology, and I think Peter Stefanovic has made an apology, and lots of things have happened. If you go onto Twitter, you'll find all of these pictures of Peter Stefanovic with marijuana bushes behind him, and people saying that this is his heritage, is illegal.
Yeah, it's not exactly a clean skin, apparently.
Apparently not, but who knows what you could believe? Who knows what you could believe on Twitter anyway?
But who cares?
Or do
we care because it's him having a go at an Indigenous bloke?
Oh, that's what I cared about. I didn't care about... I guess I was curious about the aftermath, what happened in the aftermath, because there was outrage nationally, which I think was fair enough. He was having a go at a young Indigenous man, and he shouldn't have done that. There was no need to do that. He could have just celebrated that he'd won the money. Apparently, the story was that he and his mates had stolen a buggy from an employer. They'd sorted it out. There were no charges laid against him. He sorted it out with the employer, who sounds like a good guy, paid the money back by working for nothing over weekends. So why drag that up? Be familiar with that in the child protection system.
So the question is actually, why did he drag that up? What was that all about?
I think it seems to me a racist thing to do, and just harping on tropes of young Indigenous people who we know are very overrepresented in the juvenile justice system and in the prison system. So he just seemed to be having a go at him for no reason other than sensationalism or racism. But I was interested in the aftermath too, because Peter Stefanovic did get a lot of outrage, a lot of backlash. There was a Wikipedia. This is where, on the one hand, I love Wikipedia, but I also know you have to be suspicious when you use it, because there was a Wikipedia entry saying that he'd lost his job, which I know has been revised now.
Yeah.
And Sky News has made an apology, and Peter Stefanovic himself has made a direct apology as well. So they've finally done the right thing.
But I guess what I wonder about is, he planned to ask this question.
Yes, of course he did.
So what did he expect the ramifications to be from asking a question which blatantly was racist? he wouldn't have necessarily asked that of a white person, perhaps. He knew that he was putting this young bloke, who isn't, because he's a young bloke, extremely articulate anyway. He knew he was putting on the spot, and he knew that it was designed to embarrass him.
Yes.
So what dickhead does that in an effort to embarrass a young Indigenous man? What does that say about?
Well, you probably summed it up with that. Peter Stefanovic was a dickhead.
Yeah, he was. He is. And so why? And then
it was dickhead behaviour anyway.
And they knew, and Sky News, knew once it was aired that they'd have to apologise, so they prepared for all of that. But it gets, I think the annoying thing here is it gets Sky News a whole lot of clicks they don't deserve. And people start, having a look at it, and I think Media Watch or Media Matters.
Media Bites.
Media Bites.
So Paul Barry took
the story. So, and it just winds up with all this coverage about a story which should have been celebrating a young Indigenous man who won $1 million and what that could do for his impoverished family. That should have been the story, done, dusted, but the morons like Sky News decide that they have to make a bigger issue of it. Then the mainstream media, regretfully, have to follow that through, and then they have to participate. Yeah,
but then what also happened is that a guy that I follow on Twitter, who's a good guy in my book, he's a social justice lawyer in the UK by the name of Peter Stefanovic.
Oh, yes.
And eventually I saw this tweet from him, and I'm paraphrasing, saying something like, hey, hang on a minute. I'm not Peter Stefanovic, a journalist from Sky News in Australia, but I'm getting these hundreds, and he did say hundreds of tweets from angry Australians telling me off for something I haven't done, and which I found amusing and alarming, really.
Well, I guess if you've got the name, it's unfortunate it should have a name like Peter Stefanovic.
Well, Peter Stefanovic in the UK might now decide to change his name. He is a good guy. Yeah. He's not like the Peter Stefanovic from Australia.
So in other words, you can't blame a person. You can't view a person simply by their name.
No.
Because that might not be the person you're referring to anyway.
Exactly, and they should take more care with that and just do a little bit of
So Peter Stefanovic in Australia should have made sure that his name didn't match anybody else's in the world. Is that what you're trying to say?
No, what I'm saying is the angry Australians attacking Peter Stefanovic in the UK should have done a little bit of research, like click on his name and find out that he's located in the UK. It's actually not very hard to do.
Yeah, but then maybe they're hoping that Peter Stefanovic had just moved to the UK.
Can we get rid of him?
Yeah.
Oh, so has Morrison gone yet, by the way?
We can live in hope.
We can live in hope.
I don't know. Hopefully.
Right. So that was that story. My chuckle was about Peter Stefanovic calling on Australians here to leave him alone, poor guy. He'd be well able to cope with that. But I wanted to raise something with you. Is it okay to move on?
Go for it.
Because there was a story yesterday about the broken child protection system in New South Wales. And I just have to say that I never think these systems are broken. I actually think they've been ill-designed from the start. So I just want to make that. Anyway, that's the title of it, this broken New South Wales child protection system. And the article is about New South Wales, but I wanted to come back to South Australia in a minute. There's a woman there who's finally, after 20 years, and if we had a conversation, I'd love to ask her why it took her 20 years to speak out, but she finally got to the point where she couldn't bear working in the New South Wales child protection system anymore. So she's resigned and she now has spoken out. And she says, and I quote, that while it could be difficult to hear and see what was happening to children in their own homes, she felt the welfare system was also abusive to them, and that's the ABC's quotation marks. The New South Wales government last week revealed that more than 400 children in New South Wales were being put in hotels, motels and caravan parks, supervised by a rotating roster of staff in high-cost emergency care arrangements. If you could just imagine what it would be like for your 3 or 5-year-old to be looked after by constantly changing adults you have no relationship with, Ms. Huber said. And after a period of being separated, the agency placed this child, Ray, and his 3 siblings in one household in October 2023, where more than 10 people provided care for them. So now the magistrate who was looking at this case said there was nothing appropriate about the arrangement. But what I wanted to talk to you about, it's been bothering me, funnily enough, ever since the Ben Robert Smith case, but that might seem entirely irrelevant. I had an epiphany that
There's
day.
a divergence.
That's a divergence, but that's kind of irrelevant. What I was thinking about the balance of probability argument that was put forward last year in his case, that on the balance of probability, he was a murderer, is a murderer.
Yeah, and the same with Lemon's case.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think I had asked you about, it was the balance of probability point that I was interested in. And we had a discussion, and I asked you about how the magistrate in the children's court make decisions, at least in South Australia, might be different elsewhere, at least in South Australia, how they make decisions about when a child should be removed from their family. And you said to me it was on the balance of probability that the parent couldn't care appropriately for the child.
Yeah.
Right. But there's nothing about the state. So my issue is that the Department of Child Protection lawyers come in, they argue that on the balance of probability, this child needs to be removed because the parents aren't caring for them. But the state never has to argue that on the balance of probability, they can do a better job of looking after that child.
Yeah, that's right, because there's a number of reasons for this. I think the first reason is that there's not the legislation that supports the notion that the state may not be doing a good job, that they may actually be shitty in what they're doing. The legislation is geared towards the parents being shitty parents.
So the underlying assumption has been always, what, that the state's a better parent?
Yeah, yeah.
And yet the evidence over at least 100 years, more than that, is that they're not.
Well, the state, I guess the point is that the state is assigned the responsibility to care for children who are unsafe.
Yes.
So that's clearly defined within the legislation. But there's lots of things in the legislation that they don't consider, which they should. Number one is the major decision makers around what happens to children are social workers. Social workers don't even get a mention in the legislation, right? The other carers for kids are obviously foster parents. They don't get a mention. Kinship carers don't get a mention. So all of the people
So
that
who
are
does?
the state.
Just the state.
Just the state. Yeah. So the state is lumbered with the task of caring for kids in an environment which does not care for them. And the magistrate, the point I want to make is that the magistrate is restricted by the legislation. So in order for them to look at the care of the state, you need to have some significant changes to the legislation that would encompass a whole lot of care arrangements. So they'd have to start looking at where's the kid going to go, who are they going to live with, how long are they likely to live there, what are their behavioural issues that have to be addressed, are there people that are appropriately trained to be able to care for those children?
Yes.
There's a
So I take
plethora.
your point about the legislation, but don't you think they're appropriate things for somebody to be asking?
You can only
remove the parents. And I appreciate the limitations, but shouldn't that legislation therefore be changed? And
yeah, well, the only
why
way
hasn't it been changed, given that we've had untold inquiries?
Well, because the government, the parliamentarians, and others don't see those gaps. They're blind.
They don't
to those
connect
gaps.
the dots.
No, they don't. They don't.
Still make this.
We as professionals have been talking about this for decades.
Yeah, for decades.
And nothing. One of my biggest frustrations, I guess, is that nothing's ever changed in that space, and that is because somehow, if you took it away, if you start to look outside the government, you're going to have a whole lot of spaces in which it's vacant. There's I don't know how to put it. There's just this unknown concept that firstly, should communities be responsible for children, right? Should other care arrangements be the key issues here, apart from just the government looking after these kids? Indigenous kids, for example, being looked after by their community. So there's lots of areas in which the government would refuse to go because their belief is that well, the belief is that they're so risk averse that they are the only ones that can have control of this for fear it may just blow out into something out of control. The reality is, I think, that if tested, they would find that a whole lot of other arrangements
Could be
made that were in the best interest of children, and that would help them to disseminate, if you like, their level of responsibility around all of this. But because they're fearful that the public will, like, you find that when there's a death of a kid in care, for example, the public goes bananas, the papers go crazy, becomes first front page news, and they're fearful that if they opened it out, they themselves would be open to all sorts of accusations, I guess, because it still remains that kids will be returned back to environments, and some of those kids may be harmed in those environments.
And there's a case in Queensland at the moment going ahead where children were returned to a mum who shouldn't have had those children back, and she ended up leaving them in a hot car for 8 hours or something, and the children died. So there was a case where the children should never have been returned.
Yeah.
And it looks like from...
But there are also cases of parents who just act badly and their kids die, or kids die through accidents, like in swimming pools and whatever. So there's lots of cases where kids in the other community, the non-careship community, where kids...
You mean in the non-impoverished communities?
Well, not always. I think that's unfair. But certainly there are lots of kids that suffer a whole lot of other abuses, domestic violence abuses. Well, we can look at the middle class area where kids living in domestic violence that they never get heard about. That those issues around DV never get addressed because they're middle class and they have they're kind of hidden in that sense. There's not the purveying.
Yeah, what I meant by the impoverished, it's usually impoverished people, parents who get picked on by the child protection system. That's what I meant by that.
Yeah.
There will be deaths in other families.
Yeah.
Apart from those, but they're the ones who get picked on.
So the question is, how do we create a system that is safer? And we can't. No one has this, and professionals will talk about it. I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know what's going to happen to this child in 10 years' time. The reality is that the history tells us, and this is factual, that kids in care have worse outcomes.
Well, that bothers me, you see, that's right. So if a magistrate was sitting there and being presented with the opportunity of either leaving the child with the children who weren't very good, with the parents who weren't very good, or removing them and putting them in a system where they're probably, according to the outcomes, doesn't always happen, and we shouldn't stereotype the children, but they're more likely to end up not going on to university, ending up in the prison system, statistically, then wouldn't you think, maybe I'd have to have a second thought about removing that child?
Well, if you've got the mindset that the kids are, or the parents, I should say, are unlikely to change. So the first negative concept that often gets bandied about, I think, is that parents can't change. So if you've got an alcohol problem, mental health problem, and there's domestic violence, whatever, you're always going to be taking drugs. You've always going to be feeling unwell about yourself mentally, and you're always going to be entering into relationships that are violent. So a lot of these false assumptions are made about parents to start with.
So can I ask you a question, heading back to that first story, that if that young man, unlikely to happen, but if that young man Keegan, who's won his $1 million, but later on didn't have the money, was about to go to court for losing his children, would they drag up the old story as Peter Stefanovic did?
Yeah, probably.
They would do the same thing, wouldn't they?
Probably, because there's many of examples of women who have had previous domestic violence relationships, and those relationships usually get highlighted as an example of the fact that they can't find appropriate relationships now, and therefore will not be able to in the future. But the problem here is that, take the example of the one you raised of the court looking at what happens to a child when they leave, right? And they're going to take some sort of care arrangement. But let's imagine for a moment you say, we're going to put a social worker, a psychologist, a speech therapist, a mental health professional, and a parenting worker with you and with that family, and they're going to work with you for a 12-month period. And then at the end of the 12 months, we're going to reevaluate and see what progress you've made. Then we'll do another evaluation, you see. So let's assume, for example, they put that sort of system in place. If they did, a judge is more likely to say, okay, great, let's put them back with the family. Let's not traumatise them by them being in care. They can live with and watch the family progress.
And could they continue with that team working for them?
Yeah. Well, obviously, because let's say you've got 2 kids that would ostensibly be placed in care. Well, that's around $700,000 a year to keep them in care. Doesn't it make much more sense to be able to spend between $150,000 and $200,000 on that family to ensure that those kids are not longer traumatised by being in care, but also can benefit by families that make decisions about improving the way they live?
Well, I would agree with that.
But the point is those
the system doesn't work like that, which goes back to what I was saying, that I don't think the system is broken so much as really badly designed in the first place. It was never intended to put money and support for those people who needed money and support. The solution was always rip the children away.
But they do it piecemeal. They,
like sometimes they might be more supportive.
Well, you'll have, people like myself that used to work with these families, often for free, admittedly, but you also have domestic violence services and drug and alcohol services that would put up their hand to work with these families. But they were never...
So there's no concerted team effort really amongst all those services?
No, there's not like, a whole, 4 or 5 services that are working together with this one family over a long period of time. There are these services, which there might be a drug and alcohol bloke that sort of works with them spasmodically and has them do their drug tests and whatever. There might be a mental health professional that sees them once every few months just to check up on them. There's no consistency in anything that they do. And as a result of that, but come back to your original point, the reason why all of this occurs in the way that it does is because no politician has ever really taken the time to change the system, to change the legislation that caters for all these other things we've just been talking about.
Which is probably one of the reasons why you should have gone into politics.
Well, we tried. No one was interested.
You did try.
And that's another thing.
Well, that is the other thing, isn't it?
Well,
as you say, nobody's interested until there's a death.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yes. And then everybody throws their hands up in horror.
In fact, I actually remember somebody saying that to you. Somebody who knew about the voting system said you'll never get into politics unless at the time you're running as a candidate, there happens to be a death of a child in care.
And it fascinates me that most people believe that the child protection system is for everybody else but them. And that they, I don't know how many times, particularly grandparents who've come to and said, I've heard about these cases, I've heard about the Child Protection Department, but I never thought it would encompass me or capture me until such time as my grandchildren were taken. And then they're horrified
at how it works.
And I'm thinking, well, where the fuck were you when other kids were being removed? And you could have put up your hand and you could have said, I care. But no, most of the people that fight for these kids are people, with the exception of myself, I guess, but most people fight for these kids where they have had encountered the child protection system and realise how flawed it actually is.
And I guess your encounter came from
working with them.
Working with people who'd been badly impacted.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Whereas my interest is a little bit more personal, but I've never actually challenged the system in the way that you have. Interestingly enough. So the third, so I did want to come back to that point that Peter Stefanovic in Australia, not the UK dude, who's a good dude, social justice lawyer, Peter Stefanovic in Australia is not that different to the child protection workers when they hark back on errors in the past and bring it up to the future. Really, is he? So in other words, you called him a dickhead.
Which he is.
Which he is. But there are other people in systems, particularly in the child protection system, who do exactly that sort of thing.
Well, the point is that we all have biases, and we all have we all do, and we all have investment in what we believe is the right thing for us. So Peter Stepanovich is no different from a social worker, for example, working in the system, because
that's my point.
Because he could see that he was going to gain something from this for himself. Not about the young bloke. No. It was never about him. It was
never about him.
It was about clicks, and it was about how important Peter was.
Yes.
And for social workers, it's never about the client. It's not never, that's unfair, I guess. Generally, it's not about the client. It's about, the system in which they work, how they're going to look to their superior, are they doing the right job according to the system that governs them? And will they have a job at the end of the day?
Yes.
They're the drivers.
They're the drivers, which is why perhaps, and it's probably unfair of me to say, but why would it take somebody 20 years of working in that system to finally speak out? Anyway, I shouldn't criticise, because she has at least done that, but it does bother me that people don't speak out.
Well, it's a good point. I had a young woman beginning of last year who contacted me because she'd just graduated the year before. She'd been working for a few months, I think, in DCP, and she had had enough. Her experiences were the same as mine when I was in placement. I had a go at them for calling families feral. What would I know? I was only a social work student at the time. But at least my values were saying, well, that's wrong. That's not an appropriate language. That's categorising, putting them in boxes and redefining who they are before you even have a chance to understand their content.
Which will affect how you interact with that person. Of course it will.
You judge them.
Yeah, exactly.
And she could see all of that stuff. And she could see that they were racist. They were sexist classes.
Yeah.
They were the whole thing. We talked about mother blaming and what they do with that, and she agreed that's what they do. She could see it, but she felt so powerless. She resigned.
Yes, she resigned.
As a lot of them do, because she felt so powerless in that system that she could never have got her point across adequately. She asked me actually to support her while she was going through that decision-making process. And I guess was wondering what I could do as an independent social worker. But at the end of the day, she left, which they do. And
I think that in New South Wales, they do talk about the churn rate.
They did in that article.
In that article as well. So it's not just in South Australia that eventually people leave.
The churn rate's terrible. It is here in South Australia. It's shocking.
Can't you hear the calls for another Royal Commission coming, even though
No, we don't need another Royal Commission.
No, they just need
But we need better social workers. That's the point.
Or social workers who are listened to by the sound of it as well.
Yeah. Well, you need social workers at the management level who actually understand what's going on, who can listen to, because they don't have to just listen to it. See, sometimes a lot of the social workers firstly, they're often young. That's a strict criticism. So these people... You're
not being ageist?
Well, I am.
Oh, okay.
Because they don't have any life experience whatsoever. They come with this book-based knowledge, this theoretical version of what things should be, how they're taught at university. And sometimes what they've been taught at university doesn't necessarily fit what happens on the ground either. And they don't have any real life experience and some time to fit into that and to integrate their values. Their values are set often before they leave university about how they wish. And then some of those who have got misguided values, as I would see them, have those values reinforced
by the system
itself, as opposed to having those values challenged by the system and say that's not how you're supposed to work.
Well, so probably we should be running all this.
I should be Premier, and
okay.
I'd love to have been Child Protection Minister, because it shook that fucking place up like never before.
Yeah.
And probably it would have been the detriment to the organisation, because at the end of the day I probably would have wanted to sack everybody in there.
Would have been expensive for the state. Okay, I wanted to ask your advice on this next story. I think last week we talked about last week or the week before, sometime, we talked about the stabbing in the suburb of Wakeley in New South Wales of a bishop by a 15 or 16-year-old teenager. Yeah, remember that story?
Mm-hmm.
And it was turned into that designated a terrorist attack or whatever, which that's not what I wanted to talk to you about today. Because what I saw yesterday, which made me uncomfortable, so this is where I was going to seek your advice. I saw this story about the bishop who was stabbed. It wasn't a fatal stabbing. He's back in church. He's live streaming his forgiveness thing, which is a whole nother topic of conversation. But this story in the Sydney Morning Herald yesterday said that back in 2013, an 18-year-old had approached the bishop, because she was very vulnerable. Her father had been abusive. She was looking for help. And she ended up taking him to court for a sexual encounter, what she said was a sexual encounter. And according to the magistrate, he was a sleaze, not her words, he was a sleazebag.
The bishop was.
The bishop was a sleazebag. He had taken advantage of a vulnerable young person. It wasn't, her specific words was, not the actions of a man of grace. Clearly, she doesn't know too much about the priests in the Roman Catholic Church. But anyway, so
let's not go down.
Let's go not there. So the magistrate did tell him off for his sleazy behaviour in getting into bed with this young woman, touching her sexually. But she ended up not charging him because she said there wasn't sufficient evidence that he knew that she was saying no.
Well, why was she in court if they hadn't charged him?
Oh, sorry, or hadn't convicted him, sorry.
Convicted him, yeah.
Hey, so he was in church, yeah, he was in court because of the charges. Now, I saw that story and then I didn't end up forwarding it on Twitter.
No, we're talking about it on the internet instead. There's a vast difference between putting it on Twitter
and
talking about
my reluctance to pass it on, because I was thinking, why is this story coming out now? And is this story coming out now almost like of a justification for the man to have been stabbed? Do you remember somebody said to us when we first heard about this story, somebody said, I wouldn't be surprised if that young man had been sexually abused by this bishop or by some other clergy, which is entirely possible given the stories that we know. But I wondered why the stories come out so late.
Well,
I guess
had he not,
interested in
I guess the reality is that had he not been attacked in the way that he was, and he didn't become such a public figure as a result of all of that, probably would never have. But because he is a public figure, people delve. I'm not saying that it's a good thing that people delve. Often it is, because it does uncover other stuff. But in this particular case, the delving would have been the genesis of the delving would have come from the fact that he's now a public figure, and that the people. So the question around journalism is people have the right to know. It's in the public interest.
Yes, is it in the public interest now for us to know that the man's a total sleazebag?
Allegedly.
Allegedly. Allegedly.
Is it? Well, I personally did. I think it's in the public. Yeah, it becomes a public interest story because of what happened at Walkley. So yes, it is in public interest. Whether that doesn't mean that it's a story that necessarily needs to be told. He wasn't found guilty in the end, was it?
No, but I think he got sacked or deposed as a bishop. And
so there were repercussions.
And there were repercussions. He was ordered not to contact the woman for 5 years, even though she was a member of the church. 2 months later, in August 2014, he addressed a large public gathering to rebut various criticisms he said had made against him by the original church that he was with. I think he was sacked. And then in parts of, he acknowledged he was deposed from the church as a bishop in 2014. So he's gone on to do something else now. But he says here he's defended his use of the title. So he's called himself bishop.
Yeah,
so
it's It's an independent
Is it
church, I think.
church?
It's not
Yeah,
just
yeah, I think so. But this is a bit disturbing because he says you can tell me off, swear at me, spit in my face, drag me in the streets, I will love you, he said in one video. But you come and say, I don't belong to Jesus Christ, I'm not a bishop, I don't have the rank of the Lord Jesus, I will shred you if you stand in my way. I will shred you to pieces.
I said,
is that a threat or just...
Yeah, it is. I said initially when the attack came on him, my response was, I don't believe he's a very nice person.
Yeah, yes.
And I think perhaps the point is the attack on him was wrong.
Yes.
The anti-Muslim stuff is wrong. The anti-Semitism is wrong. Hate speech is wrong. All of that stuff is really unhelpful. Doesn't alter the fact that he was attacked. Doesn't alter the fact that apparently he's allegedly a sleazebag.
Yes, yeah, allegedly.
Doesn't alter those facts.
It doesn't alter those.
And I guess we sit back, we think, well, now that we understand all those facts, we need to make up our own mind as to who he is. But then the question was, well, why do we need to make up our own mind? Who cares? He doesn't come into my life. I don't give a shit.
I'm going to go back to forgetting about him.
Exactly.
Oh, yeah. I won't forget about that young man who's now been charged with terrorism.
No.
But I can forget about him.
Absolutely. He doesn't play any part of my life. So I wanted to finish off on, and I'm just wondering what you think about this. And I'll tell you why I think it's important. There's this article in the ABC as well that says New South Wales government threatens some Western Sydney libraries funding over same-sex parenting book ban. So what happened was a library had a book about same-sex parenting.
Oh dear.
Which wasn't explicit.
Right.
It was just about
just two
parenting.
Just two women or two men or something.
Whatever. But it was about how to respond to conversations that they might have with you, these same-sex couples, about being a male, being a female, about sex, about whatever. So how do they have those couples? And there's a statement here that says that when civilizations turn to burning books or banning books, it is a very bad sign. That is equally true for local councils. And when I read this story, the first thing I thought of what happened in Florida in the United States. And are we getting to the point whereby we're going to be banning books because one person. So in this council,
it was only one person
who complained, but in the council it was passed by a majority.
Okay. So
there were, I don't know, 4 people who said yes, it should be banned, 3 people that said no. There were the dissenters, but nevertheless, my question is: are we going to get to a point whereby we become so homophobic that we look at still? But are we going to look at everything that we see through the eyes of a homophobic prism? So these books are going to corrupt our kids. Blah 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 blah. They've been there for ages, right? So and now we're going to start burning books as a result, just because we don't like them.
Corrupt anyone.
Well, are we going to? Because it goes from here to any books around Aboriginal history. Are they next on this list?
John Howard would have liked that. I'm pretty sure that he and Alan Tudge wanted to change the system and get rid of some of those books. I have two thoughts about that. One is that people don't actually realise how corrupted our children are in terms of two genders anyway. So they're brainwashed to like dolls or like cars from year dot, usually. I'm generalising quite significantly. So people don't understand that sort of brainwashing, social construction stuff is going on in the first place. Yeah. So that's ignorance on their part. My other thought is that why would you be so fearful of what your children do and not trust them that you have to ban books?
Well, I think it comes out here where it says, during the council meeting, Councillor Christo said same-sex parenting books did not align with the values of his community.
Darling.
Now, Why is he the arbiter
He's the arbiter of
for
it.
whatever the values are in his community?
And in Australia, same-sex marriage, we had this debate.
Mm.
Same-sex marriage is now legal. So why does
Done, dusted, gone. Why are we
so scared? I think the issue is that some people are so scared about other choices other people make that they seem to have to control them.
Well, they say things like, he said here, this community is a very religious community, is very family orientated, whether they're Catholic, Orthodox, Islamic, Hindu, whatever their background, they all have the same beliefs, families, religion, values. They don't.
Of course they don't.
That's the biggest bullshit statement I've ever heard.
That he knows that community very well. Or perhaps they're not really honest with him because of his views.
They all have what does it mean by religious values anyway? Like religious values,
very diverse,
extensive,
yes.
From
from very orthodox to very liberal in every religion.
That's right. It's just a wanker. Let's put it that way.
All right, so we've had a dickhead and a wanker.
We have, but it's
will we get to the point of banning books? I hope not.
Let's ban him.
Yeah.
Let's ban people that are extreme who try.
You don't want to do a Pauline Hanson and tell them to go back to where they come from.
No, I don't care. I don't think we should just have a camp somewhere in the middle of Australia and just lock them all up.
Trump.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good idea. Anybody who's trying to take away our see, that's the extreme, isn't it? So, anybody who disagrees with us, we should move to
send them off.
That is so right-wing, that, isn't it?
It is. It's terrible. Whereas, why can't he just choose a different library to go to or not borrow that book?
Ah, that's right. And why not?
Just not.
And that book they're talking about was in a children's section. My answer to that problem was move it to another section that isn't the children's section if you're offended, where kids aren't going to look at it.
Yeah. There are other alternatives.
And why can't we as parents, same-sex parents or whatever, why can't we as parents choose the stuff that we want our kids to read? I mean, kids
I'm not going to rely on anybody other than us, which we didn't as parents, anyone to dictate to us.
Pretty laissez-faire as parents, to be quite honest. But
did we know what our children were reading?
Well, we didn't know what our children were doing half the time, I can tell you now. Even though thankfully they turned out okay, which was probably more good luck than anything else. Anyway, thanks for that. It's a very good discussion again on our podcast. So thanks for being with us, everybody. Thanks, Dee.
Thanks, Tony.
Take care, look after yourselves, and more importantly, be safe.